Well, I don't know about you, but the election results are in, and I'm feeling a bit uneasy, to say the least. It's like we're
Yeah.
all standing on shifting sand here, just trying to figure out what comes next.
Yeah, it's definitely a time of heightened anxiety for a lot of us. And it's completely natural when we feel uncertain, to look for those parallels in history, trying to make sense of things, what could happen.
I think that's exactly right. And that's where this piece by Olga Lautman comes in. Now, that America elected a dictator, what can we expect? A guide to the worst-case scenario.
Mm.
She uses Russia under Putin as a case study.
And
Some of the parallels she draws, let me tell you,
yeah.
they're chilling.
Yeah, it's really important, though, to emphasize right up front. This isn't about saying America is Russia or that history repeats itself exactly. Lotman's piece is really more of a framework for understanding potential tactics and trajectories, not a crystal ball.
Right, like a toolkit for spotting warning signs, for understanding how democratic erosion can happen step by insidious step.
Precisely. And Lotman breaks it down into 10 key areas. Her first point focuses on how democratic institutions are weakened. And it's not the dramatic overnight collapse that people imagine.
More like termites in the foundation, right?
Wow.
You don't see the damage until it's too late. She talks about the courts being packed with loyalists, opposition in Congress being systematically targeted, even federal power encroaching on states' rights.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is how she links these seemingly disparate events to a deliberate strategy. She points to Putin installing loyalists, often with criminal backgrounds, into positions of power. It makes you question what qualifications even mean in that context.
That detail about the criminal backgrounds, I gotta say, that really stuck with me. Like, suddenly,
Yeah.
the rules of the game have changed. We're not even sure what game we're playing anymore.
It highlights the insidiousness of the process, right? The erosion of norms can be so subtle, so incremental, that by the time people realize the danger, the safeguards are already gone.
So the ground is shifting beneath our feet, but it's happening so slowly we barely notice. And speaking of subtle shifts, Lautman's second point is about media manipulation. She uses this very stark image of independent media becoming an endangered species. It really makes you think about the information ecosystem we're in.
Yeah, and it's not just about outright censorship, though that certainly plays a role. Lautman describes a more multifaceted approach: hostile takeovers of media outlets, censorship disguised as disinformation control, and this flood of state propaganda that makes it hard to even separate fact from fiction.
And then there's the self-censorship aspect, where journalists start avoiding certain topics because they're afraid of the consequences. Has anyone else noticed that happening already? Certain stories just disappearing.
It's a chilling thought, isn't it? When the environment for journalism becomes so hostile, when truth-telling carries so much personal and professional risk, it creates this chilling effect that silences dissenting voices even without direct government intervention.
All right, buckle up, because Lautman's third point is where I had a serious aha moment. She talks about chaos as a strategy. Remember how insane the news cycle has been these past few years? All that drama, all that outrage. Could it have been intentional?
Lautman argues that it's a very real possibility. Authoritarians thrive on chaos. They need it. It disorients the public, making them numb to outrage, less able to process what's happening, and ultimately less likely to resist.
So it's like this constant bombardment of shock tactics, contradictory messages, blatant violations of norms, all designed to just overwhelm us, to make us throw up our hands and say, I can't even deal with this anymore.
Exactly. And while we're busy trying to make sense of the latest scandal, the regime is consolidating power behind the scenes. Think back to those chaotic times. Were there moments when you felt overwhelmed? When you just tuned it all out?
It's a brilliant, if terrifying strategy, because that feeling of exhaustion, that sense of being constantly bombarded, actually plays right into the hands of someone trying to control the narrative.
Yeah. It's a crucial insight. And it underscores the importance of staying informed, of resisting that urge to tune out. Because when we disengage, we cede power.
All right, so we've got institutions being hollowed out, media being manipulated, chaos being weaponized. And then Lautman hits us with point number 4, weaponized law enforcement. This is where things start to feel straight out of a dystopian novel.
It's certainly a disturbing shift. Lautman describes how law enforcement, instead of being a force for protecting citizens, becomes a tool of fear and control. We see this with the politicization of arrests, where opponents are targeted while loyalists are shielded, and the expansion of surveillance, where everyone is treated as a potential suspect.
And she specifically mentions the increasing militarization of police forces, which we've definitely seen more of in recent years. Incredibly unsettling. And then there's the trend of labeling protesters as domestic terrorists. I mean, that's straight out of the authoritarian playbook.
It is, and it shows how language itself can be weaponized to justify repression. By framing dissent as a threat to national security, the regime can silence opposition and justify increasingly aggressive tactics.
So we've got institutions failing, media manipulation, chaos as a strategy, and now law enforcement being turned against the people.
Okay.
And then, to make matters worse, Lautman brings up point number 5, the Constitution under threat. If even the Constitution isn't safe, what is?
Yeah, it's a sobering thought for sure. But Lautman's argument is that even something as fundamental as the Constitution can be manipulated and exploited. She uses Putin's Russia as a prime example, showing how the very framework that's supposed to protect our rights can be twisted to serve the interests of those in power.
So how does it even happen? I mean, the Constitution, it's the supreme law of the land, right? How do you even go about changing the very fabric of a nation's legal framework?
Well, Lautman outlines a few different tactics. One is packing the courts with loyalists, right, who will then interpret the Constitution in a way that favors the regime. Another is exploiting supermajorities in Congress to push through amendments that erode democratic norms. And then there's the abuse of emergency powers, which allows leaders to bypass traditional checks and balances under the guise of crisis or national security.
Oh, yeah, and let's not forget the power of rhetoric. Lautman points out how these changes can be framed as positive, as measures that actually protect the people, even when they're fundamentally undermining their rights. It's like a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Precisely. She gives specific examples like the elimination of term limits, the weakening of states' rights, and the restriction of free speech under the guise of combating disinformation. All of these measures can be sold to the public as necessary for stability or security, even as they chip away at the very foundations of democracy.
It's terrifying how easily those in power can twist the narrative. It makes you realize that vigilance is key. We can't afford to take our freedoms for granted. Even something as seemingly solid as the Constitution. We need to be aware of these tactics so we can at least call them out when we see them happening.
Absolutely. Understanding the mechanics of how democratic erosion happens, that's the first step towards resisting it. Now, Lautman's next point takes us into a realm that might seem a bit less tangible, but is no less important: the cult of personality.
But point number 6, the cult of personality. Okay, we all know about the rallies, the slogans, the whole branding aspect of modern politics, but Lautman's arguing this goes way beyond just image management, right?
Absolutely. She argues that a cult of personality is deliberately constructed using a very specific set of tools to create an almost godlike figurehead. It's about manufacturing adoration and unquestioning loyalty, not just winning votes.
So it's not just about charisma, it's about manipulation, exploiting people's emotions and vulnerabilities.
Exactly. Lautman points to tactics like nationalist rhetoric, where the leader is portrayed as the only one who can save the nation from some perceived threat. She also talks about religious exploitation, where the leader's authority is presented as divinely ordained, unquestionable, absolute.
And then there's historical revisionism, right? Erasing inconvenient truths, rewriting history to fit the narrative, controlling the information people have access to, so they can only see the leader in a positive light.
Precisely. And this is where education comes in. Lautman specifically mentions how education systems can be reshaped to further this agenda. Imagine a generation growing up learning a version of history that glorifies the leader, where critical thinking is discouraged, where dissent is equated with disloyalty.
Oh, that's a chilling thought. And it makes me wonder, what role does education play in our own lives? How do we know we're getting accurate information? Are we questioning the narratives we've been taught?
These are crucial questions for all of us to consider. Because if we can't trust the sources of information, if we're not equipped to think critically and challenge what we're being told, well, then we're vulnerable to this kind of manipulation.
Okay, so we've got this cult of personality being carefully cultivated. And it's all built on this foundation of distorted information and blind loyalty. So where does that lead? Well, according to Lautman, it leads to point number 7, corruption and cronyism. And this is something we've heard a lot about in recent years. But she's arguing it's not just a few bad apples, right? It's a systemic problem.
Right. In an authoritarian system, corruption becomes deeply intertwined with political power. It's not just about personal enrichment. It's a way to maintain control.
So it's like a system of rewards and punishments. Loyalists are allowed to enrich themselves while opponents are crushed, often through legal or economic means.
Exactly. Lautman uses the term oligarchs to describe this elite class of loyalists who benefit from government favors. And they amass vast wealth, often at the expense of the public good. They become complicit in the system. because they benefit directly from it.
And this is where Lautman's analysis really hits home for me. She writes, the wealth gap would grow, with ordinary citizens seeing little benefit from the nation's resources while the elites thrive. I mean, that resonates with so many people's lived experiences, right? That feeling of being left behind, while a select few seem to get richer and more powerful.
Absolutely. It speaks to a deep sense of injustice, a feeling that the system is rigged. And when corruption becomes so rampant, it erodes trust in institutions and creates a fertile ground for resentment and instability.
So we've got a cult of personality, we've got rampant corruption, and all of this, according to Lautman, leads to point number 8, aggressive foreign policy.
This is where things can start to get really dangerous. Lautman argues that in an authoritarian system, foreign policy becomes a tool for both distraction and consolidation of power.
So it's about creating a sense of external threat, to justify internal control, to rally the people around the flag, even if that means manufacturing enemies or exaggerating threats.
Precisely. She gives several examples of how this can play out. Withdrawing from alliances with democratic nations, cozying up to autocratic regimes, even provoking military conflicts to stoke nationalist sentiment and create that rally around the flag effect.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, is this about ideology or is it about distraction? Or maybe both. Is it about genuine belief in a certain worldview, or is it about manipulating public perception to maintain power?
It's a complex question, and one that historians and political scientists will likely be debating for years to come. But what's clear from Lautman's analysis is that in an authoritarian system, foreign policy is rarely about what's best for the people. It's about what serves the interests of the regime and its leader.
Okay, so we're feeling isolated from our allies. We're potentially on the brink of conflict. The economy is serving only the elites. And then Lautman hits us with point number 9, crushing civil society. This is where things start to feel truly heartbreaking, because it's about targeting the very people who are trying to make things better.
Exactly. A vibrant civil society. The NGOs, the activists, the volunteers, the everyday people who are engaged in their communities, working to solve problems and make a difference. This is the lifeblood of a healthy democracy.
Which is precisely why it's targeted in an authoritarian regime, right? Because it represents a threat to the power structure.
Precisely. Lautman describes a system where NGOs are labeled as foreign agents or even terrorists, where activists are harassed and imprisoned, where simply speaking your mind, expressing dissent, or organizing for change becomes dangerous.
Yeah, she talks about how this creates an atmosphere of fear. That leads to self-censorship. People are afraid to speak up, afraid to associate with certain groups, afraid to even think certain thoughts, because they might be labeled as disloyal or subversive.
It's a suffocating environment designed to quash any form of opposition or dissent. It preys on people's natural desire to feel safe and accepted, and it turns that desire into a weapon against them.
So let me ask you this. What would it take for you to self-censor? What line would have to be crossed for you to stay silent, even when you know something is wrong? What would have to happen for you to prioritize your own safety and comfort over your values and beliefs?
That's a question we all need to ask ourselves, because the erosion of our freedoms often starts with our own silence, with our willingness to look the other way.
Yeah.
When we see injustice happening around us, when we choose comfort over courage, we become complicit in the very systems that oppress us.
Okay, we're almost at the end of Lautman's list, and it's been a intense journey, to say the least. But point number 10 takes us into a realm that feels almost too dark to even contemplate. False flag attacks. I mean, this is straight out of a spy thriller, right?
Yes.
But she's saying this is a tactic that dictators actually use.
As unsettling as it is, false flag attacks are a well-documented tool of authoritarian regimes throughout history.
So how does it even work? What's the purpose of staging a fake attack?
Well, it's about creating a pretext for repression. By blaming an attack on opponents, foreign adversaries, or even just a convenient scapegoat, the regime can justify cracking down on dissent, ramping up surveillance, and consolidating its power.
And because people are afraid, because they're looking for someone to blame, they're more likely to accept these justifications, even if they're based on lies.
Exactly. It preys on our very basic human need for security and certainty. In the aftermath of a traumatic event, people are more likely to relinquish their freedoms in exchange for the promise of safety and protection. It's a cynical and manipulative tactic, but it's one that's been used effectively time and time again throughout history.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, and it's been intense, to say the least. But Lautman doesn't leave us on a completely hopeless note. She actually offers some suggestions for how we can push back against this kind of creeping authoritarianism. She doesn't just offer a warning, she offers a call to action.
That's right. She talks about the importance of resistance. and how it starts with individual choices, with each of us taking responsibility for the future we want to create.
So what does that look like in practice? What can we actually do to push back against this kind of encroaching darkness? What actions can we take to protect our democracy and our freedoms?
Well, Lautman outlines a few key strategies. First, she emphasizes the importance of supporting independent media, subscribing to credible news sources, sharing their work, and being willing to pay for quality journalism, recognizing that a free and independent press is absolutely essential to a functioning democracy.
Yeah, because if we're only getting our information from sources that are controlled by those in power, we lose the ability to think critically, to question the narratives we're being fed, and to hold those in power accountable. It's like being trapped in an echo chamber where only one voice is allowed.
Exactly. She also talks about the power of organizing locally, getting involved in your community, connecting with like-minded people, and working together to create change from the ground up, building networks of resistance, right? Creating spaces where people can come together, support each other, share information, and strategize about how to push back against authoritarianism.
It's about recognizing that we're not alone in this. There are people all over the country, all over the world, who are fighting for democracy, for justice, for a better future. And when we connect with those people, when we build solidarity across borders and communities, we become much more powerful than we could ever be on our own.
And finally, Lautman emphasizes the importance of connecting with global movements, sharing information, learning from each other's experiences, and building solidarity across borders, recognizing that authoritarianism isn't just a threat to one country, it's a global phenomenon. And the fight against it requires a global response.
Yeah, because the tactics we've been talking about, the erosion of democratic norms, the manipulation of information, the suppression of dissent, these aren't unique to any one country. They're happening all over the world. And when we connect with those who are fighting these same battles in other places, I think we gain valuable insights, strategies, and
A sense of shared purpose.
absolutely. When we stand together, when we share our stories and our strategies, we become a force to be reckoned with. We show those in power that they can't silence us, that we won't be divided, and that we will not give up the fight for a more just and equitable world.
So if we had to distill all of this down to one key takeaway, what would it be? What's the message we want to leave our listeners with today?
I think it's this. Awareness is power. Understanding the tactics, recognizing the patterns, and being willing to speak out against injustice. Those are the first steps to resistance. And the next step is action. Supporting independent media, organizing locally, connecting with global movements. These are all concrete actions we can take to defend our democracy and protect our freedoms. And never underestimate the power of individual action. Even small acts of resistance, when multiplied by millions, can create a tidal wave of change. It's about choosing courage over comfort, about using our voices and our actions to create a better future for ourselves and for generations to come.
The future is not set in stone. It's being shaped right now by the choices we make, the actions we take, and the stories we tell. And that, my friend, is something worth fighting for.
Absolutely. We've explored some dark possibilities in this deep dive, but I think we've also uncovered some glimmers of hope. And ultimately, it's up to each of us to decide which path we want to take. Do we succumb to fear and apathy? Or do we rise to the challenge and fight for the future we want to see?
The choice is ours.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay hopeful.